Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Welcome back. This is our first episode of 2022, and I hope your holiday season and your New Year's was excellent. I hope that we all have a great year. I'm really looking forward to some of the things that we've got planned for the podcast. Well, we're quickly building the economic apparatus that advanced the Puritan society. Last week, we talked about the initial industry for New England, the initial international industry. It was a triangular trade route between New England, Spain, and England. The Puritans were shipping codfish to Spain, and that in turn allowed those same ships to purchase Spanish wool. And the wool would then be taken to England. Textiles were a big industry in England and would be for centuries, and sold for finished goods that would be taken back to New England. Everybody was a winner, mostly. The problem was that there was not a lot of hard currency entering New England. This trade was largely carried out through credits and trade than the exchange of cash. And originally this was okay, as there were so many immigrants entering New England as permanent settlers that money was coming into the colonies. Remember, these guys were selling everything, loading up their belongings, gathering their families, and moving permanently to North America. And once that population explosion slowed, there was a severe shortage of hard, recognizable, regulated currency. The colony itself, or colonies, were not developing the kind of trade with other areas that brought money into the region, the type that could pay debts and taxes. So although the codfish industry created wealth and helped to build the shipping industry, it could not sustain the Puritan economy. Also, they had been producing excess crops and livestock to accommodate the newcomers, and those excesses were bought and paid for with the currency that the immigrants brought with them. That money was then used within the colony, as well as for debts in England. And when the immigration fell off, so did the cash. And furthermore, when the immigration slowed, that excess that they were producing was no longer needed and proved to be too expensive to ship to Europe. So no market for the excess production, no influx of currency, and a shortage of hard cash, or gold and silver, to purchase finished goods from England. They needed more, a lot more commerce, a lot more currency. They needed a viable commodity and a viable monetary system. Both emerged and they grew up together. The commodity was fur. There was a huge European fur market. The currency would be wampum. Developing the fur trade would also help the English to compete with the French and the Dutch, who were already deeply entrenched in the fur business. The problem was that the English had no experience in the fur trade. The natives did, however, and the trick became finding something that they saw as valuable. Remember what we decided last week. If you're going to build an economy from scratch, you have to start with what you have and what's available. So the most available commodity for the European market was fur. Prices and availability in Europe were volatile. North American fur was in great demand. The English had several obstacles to overcome before they could engage in the fur market with any financial success. First of all, the common trade goods that had attracted native attention were too bulky to carry far into the frontier. And there were only so many pots and tools a local population was in need of. The native market for the initial trinkets had slowed. As early as 1627, the folks at Plymouth had been aware of a type of ceremonial bead that the local natives liked. Dutchman Isaac de Razers of the Dutch West India Company had introduced wampum to Plymouth. His goal was not necessarily to help the Pilgrims, although it would help the Pilgrims to further their business up north, modern Maine. By this time, they had established a couple of trading posts in that area, but they were not very successful. De Razers knew it was only a matter of time before they looked to the west for opportunities, and that's where the Dutch were already setting up shop. And quite successfully, I might add. And by west, we mean Connecticut. It sounds strange, doesn't it? We're talking about moving west to Connecticut. But for Plymouth, it was heading west. Anyway, his goal was to head them off at the pass, to help them achieve success in Maine, far away from the Dutch interests. We've developed wampum quite extensively in previous episodes, episode 20 and 21. So we just want to touch on a few things as a reminder. The English eventually would think of wampum as money, a real currency for use with the natives. The natives thought of it not so much as a currency like you and I would understand it, or the Europeans or the English, but rather as an everything type of commodity. It was used to pay taxes and debts and tributes, no doubt, and it purchased slaves. But it was also given as a gift for friendship, and it was used ceremonially, and it was used in their clothing, and it was used for treaties. So it was a kind of currency, but it had more of an aesthetic value and less of a fiscal value than a real currency, if that makes any sense. The best wampum was produced around the Long Island Sound, both on the Long Island side and the Connecticut shoreline. But the market stretched up north into Maine and as far west as New York, Pennsylvania, the St. Lawrence River, and into Canada. Now, it did take a little while, but eventually the Pilgrims had a viable market for wampum in Maine. And once they did, they consolidated the northern trade away from the independent traders and fishermen, and they had a viable fur trade, and they made money. And this early employment of wampum on the part of the Plymouth folks made them the early powerhouse. They did not represent the wealthier class like the Puritans did. I mean, remember, these guys in Plymouth were the original hardcore dissenters who had first settled in the Netherlands. Probably the only group to colonize more for religious freedom than financial gain. They were quick to set up trade not just in Maine, but Connecticut and Rhode Island as well. In fact, they had been so successful early on that John Winthrop of Massachusetts Bay had complained that they had taken all the good spots. But that didn't last. I mean, the French ended up with Maine. And like I've said, we'll develop the French, New France, to the extent that it affected the English. Soon enough, we'll talk about the frontier wars. We'll definitely spend some time in the New England frontier. I mean, it got nasty. But also later in New York and the St. Lawrence Seaway. These discussions will begin to involve the Huron and the Ottawa, the Abenaki, the Iroquois, groups that we've only hinted at so far. And as we've seen in time, Massachusetts Bay would settle Connecticut. They took full advantage of their lopsided agreements with the Pequots, forcing both the Dutch and the Pilgrims of Plymouth to forfeit most of their claims. The sheer numbers of Massachusetts Bay settlers overran everybody else. And such was the settling of Connecticut. And we saw that saga play out during our Pequot series. And as we've also previously developed, Roger Williams would grab Rhode Island. And again, we covered his exploits over the course of the Pequot series, as well as a couple of episodes bearing his name. And if you're newer to the podcast, those are not bad episodes to go back and listen to, the ones on Roger Williams. Frankly, all of them, but more specifically, Roger Williams. Williams was shrewd. He had managed to befriend both the Wampanoags and Massasoit, as well as the Narragansetts and their leaders. The reality is, once the English figured out that the exploitation of wampum could be used to trade for furs, the race was on. And the race was oftentimes everyone for himself, or every colony for itself. And Massachusetts Bay had the corner on population. It was the need for currency and the need for a European commodity that created the absolute lust and the bloodbath that fueled the Puritan consolidation of the wampum production. Most notably with the destruction of the Pequots and the manipulation of everyone else, including the Narragansett. The magistrates of Massachusetts Bay, as a group, collectively, and then John Winthrop specifically, proved to be masters at manipulation. They played chess while everybody else seemed to be playing checkers. It was only through political wrangling that the once Massachusetts Bay settlers eventually wrestled Connecticut from the magistrates to gain their own autonomy. Here's where that analogy of the transparencies that we've talked about so many times comes in. We've covered a lot of these years already through various other series. The overview of the individual colonies, the wampum episodes, John Underhill, John Mason, Roger Williams, Anne Hutchinson. These events all took place in the 1630s. Even the battles with Samuel Gorton in the early 1640s all happened within this time frame. And I wanted to break these events up so that we can get a clear picture of each one. But keep in mind, these were happening simultaneously. So in your brain, stack these up. Pick them up and turn them around in your head. Consider all of these things happening at once. I mean, there's a lot going on. The sheer volume of what was happening at such record speed fascinates me. So remember, as a group, the Puritans were hemmed in on all sides. I mean, Massachusetts Bay also enjoyed the help of New Hampshire's Pennachucks. But those areas round out the Puritan world of colonization. Plymouth, Connecticut, which had, New Haven and Saybrook and Massachusetts Bay, and that was the formation of the United Colonies. They formed those colonies because they were surrounded for mutual defense and support. I mean, you had the Dutch in New York and the Swedes and the Dutch in the South around, contemporary Philadelphia and Delaware. The French were up north. So they had a lot of furs, but that population of beaver, that was the big one, beaver. But there's also otter and fox and raccoon and muskrat and bear, and the black wolf was quickly depleted in their area. It was their control of the wampum that led to their success, because that could be transported all over fairly easily. All the native groups coveted it, especially the Iroquois, and it could secure furs from very long distances. And we'll talk more about the actual trade in future episodes. The fur trade became a big deal for a very long time. The Beaver Wars, the Iroquois Wars, were fought over decades. So at this time, there were other things that the natives would have traded for that could have brought wealth quicker, possibly. Things the Puritans would not trade. For a long time, there was a prohibition on guns and alcohol. You didn't want to sell those things to the natives. All of the European powers understood that the guns were the great equalizer. But in time, guns were introduced to the equation, if for no other reason than that they could speed the delivery of the furs. The natives also wanted the guns from their respective European partners for use in protection and warfare. The French weaponized their friends up north, the Dutch weaponized the Iroquois, and then later, reluctantly, when the Dutch were gone, the English would as well. Even the New England natives slowly acquired guns. Other restrictions were in place dating back to King James on horses and boats for much of the same reasons, because they could have theoretically been used against the English as well. So the easy-to-trade items were taboo. It's safe to say that all trade was regulated to the English advantage. Mother country first, and then to the colonies. So anyway, with the development of the wampum trade, Europeans were now able to offer the same finished goods like knives and combs and scissors and hatchets and needles and awls and hoes and looking glasses, etc., as well as textiles, clothes. The natives loved the English clothes. The Puritan merchants even created basically an industry within the larger English textile industry. They would order clothes from England to suit the native tastes in color and fashion, right down to, as one historian recorded, papoose coats. The wampum drove all of this trade. There was not a monopoly on its production, but it did take a certain skill, and so it was plentiful, but it was still in demand. But fur was king. And as the fur trade took off, there was a fear among the English that if any trade went south, meaning if there were bad relations between the English and the natives in one area, or if one trader was dishonest, that could upset the whole trading industry. So there were regulations and licenses. This wasn't just smart, really, but also another practice they had brought from home along the lines of trade unions and the regulation of commerce. It's interesting to note that the regulations and licenses were not uniform across the colonies. They were competing against each other as much as anyone else. So, for example, Massachusetts Bay received 50% of the profits from regulated licensed traders. There were very few licenses granted at first. Eventually they kind of loosened the belt and they distributed more. But initially, there were very few licenses. New Haven claimed all of the native trade as the prerogative of the government itself. They handled everything. Rhode Island is the opposite end of the spectrum. They were the most lax on the rules and regulations. And frankly, by 1640, trade with the natives was open to everybody. The licenses not only protected the colonies from dishonest traders causing issues. You remember guys like John Stone did not do the Puritans any favors in life. Although his death was used to benefit them greatly. But also, the licenses ensured the colony's ability to get their cut through taxes and fees. It's much easier to license and regulate a few people than many. Now, eventually, liquor was regulated and traded as well. Of course, the natives did figure out in time how to produce their own alcohol. And finally, in 1668, long after the Dutch were gone, even guns were permissible, but the regulations were strict. As trade increased, so did the other regulations. Things like no trading on the Sabbath, or where you could actually trade with the natives. And credit was really discouraged because there was no real way to secure and collect it once the transaction was completed. So all this is or was great, but it still does not fully answer our fundamental question that we asked last week, that we're continuing to ask this week. What would you do to develop an economy? What about currency between the Europeans? The wampum was not recognized by England or Europe. The European currency was not recognized by the natives. Besides, it wouldn't have mattered if it was. There just wasn't enough of it to go around. But both the Puritan colonials and the natives recognized wampum's local value. Wampum purchased the furs, and then those furs could be sent back to England for finished goods to be brought back to the colonies. But it was not just used for native purchases. In short order, due to the lack of reputable European currency, or even gold and silver, wampum was a recognized local European currency. Well, a local English currency. It became legal currency, recognized by the colonial governments for public and private debt. Even though the values and supply were not stable, it worked for a while. Were you aware that the earliest colonizers in New England used beads as money? It's true. Ironically, the same year the Pequots were destroyed for their control of the wampum in 1637, the Massachusetts Bay General Court declared wampum legal tender for all transactions under 1 shilling, with a standardized value of 6 beads to a penny, 6 white beads. The blue and black beads had about double the value. And when I said ironically, I used air quotes, because I don't think there was any irony to it. Once they secured the control of the wampum, they were able to monetize it. The Bible state Massachusetts Bay was taking in massive amounts of wampum as tribute, especially after assuming basically all the former Pequot tributaries as their own. And then the Narragansetts. It's a pretty slick setup, isn't it? Assume control of the one available local currency and then monetize and regulate it. This was no accident. In 1645, Massachusetts Bay received about the same amount of wampum from the natives as they did in annual tax revenue from the citizens, 2,000 fathoms, or roughly 460 pounds. At least one historian has pointed out the irony that the tribute paid by defeated or controlled natives helped to pay for further advancement of the colony. In other words, the natives paid for their own destruction. They paid money to the very people dismantling their societies. And the value and the regulations increased. By 1641, Massachusetts Bay recognized wampum as legal tender for all debts under 10 pounds. That might have been its peak. In 1643, it was 40 shillings. But the bubble was bound to burst. The situation went from boom to bust, frankly, pretty quickly, just a few short years. As wampum production increased with demand and distribution, and the available furs decreased, the value of wampum tanked. And that's an economic policy that seems to hold true to this day. Flooding a market with currency only devalues that currency. Anyways, that's what happened. There was a lot of wampum going around, and the furs, the commodities began to be depleted. And eventually the value of that wampum decreased. It was an arbitrary value that had been assigned to it anyways. There was nothing backing that wampum currency up, right, for value. But, for a time, it did enjoy a broad appeal for a number of reasons. Not the least of which was that it was easily available and transportable compared to the other commodities that they might have used to trade, like wheat or peas or pork or Indian corn. But it had its limitations. The big problem was that there was a lot of counterfeiting going on, a lot of English counterfeiting. They would use false beads, not the beads they should have, or they would try to dye the white beads black or blue because they had larger value. These counterfeit beads caused a lot of problems. First of all, it dilutes the currency, right? So that also devalues it even further. But the natives were not easily deceived. They could tell what was counterfeit and what was not. The English were the more gullible of the groups, right? So it always seemed to end up in the possession of the English. And again, so the value fell and regulations on wampum rose, and that's never good. The other major problem was the regional nature of it. It was good that it could be used for local debt. That allowed all of the kind of official currency to be used for English trade and debt. But it was still a damper on expanding real trade and importing real currency. I think the writing was on the wall when its decline was recognized officially. In 1649, the General Court ceased accepting wampum as payment for taxes. It was still acceptable for private debt, however. But 12 years later, in 1661, it was finished. The General Court demonetized it altogether. It was no longer officially accepted for private debts either. But the currency shortage still existed, especially in rural areas. I mean, you can't simply legislate a problem away, right? But in private matters, especially the further into the frontier you traveled, it continued to be used and accepted for decades. I mean, into the 18th century, as a matter of fact. So although it had helped the colonies through a crisis, wampum could not be sustained as a currency. As the furs became less available, its value plunged. When the fur industry slowed, in part because of the Civil War, the Boston merchants had no use for it. Remember, by now Boston was the leader, right, economically and politically. So to recap, the fur trade had helped to propel New England into commercial success, but it peaked in the 1640s. The population of the area's fur-bearing animals had been systematically depleted. And there were other reasons for needed change. Again, the English Civil War had a negative impact on transatlantic trade. Thus, like the triangle trade of codfish and wool, which was another piece of the same emerging economy, wampum had only been a stopgap, a pivotal, vital stopgap, but a stopgap nonetheless. By the time it had been demonetized, alternate trade routes and partners had begun to be established. Actually, by the late 1640s, about the time Massachusetts Bay stopped accepting wampum for taxes and public debt, there were lucrative commercial enterprises forming with the Caribbean, the West Indies, Africa, and Europe. But again, due to the Civil War, trade activity was altered. New direct channels were developed that may not have been otherwise. So this was a real benefit to the colonies and ultimately a deficit for England. I mean, this is where the colonials in North America really got a taste for trade without the mother country's interference. But the West Indies, the Caribbean, and Africa were warm weather climates, and there wasn't a huge demand for furs in those markets. They were also largely emerging colonial markets themselves, and they were looking for partners to purchase their goods and supply things that they couldn't produce. And these are some of the factors that led to a huge decline in trade with the natives, a source of resentment for the natives who had now grown dependent on English goods. The beauty of these new budding relationships was that these areas had gold and silver to trade with. They had commodities that New England wanted. New England had goods that they wanted. And as New England's trade increased with these colonies, real hard currency began to pour in. The silver began to appear in the late 1640s. I mean, do you see the relative correlations or patterns as they're developing this economy? They're using what they had at the time that they had it, but they were able to quickly pivot when opportunity presented itself. And a lot of these other colonies were like-minded Puritans. So they had some connections going back to England. Some of these guys, they knew each other. Some guys actually had interests both in New England and in these other regions. So again, there was no need originally, no urgency for currency as long as the immigration was flowing in. But then they acted in their local best interest. The wampum was recognized as regional currency once the Pequots were gone, and they could control it. And then the wampum was demonetized as silver became increasingly available. I mean, it's no coincidence that by the late 1640s, when silver is beginning to enter the colony in some, measurable volume, that they then demonetized the wampum. And that made it easier to establish trade routes in other areas for new commodities, all to the Puritan advantage. And with these new markets, another triangular trade industry began to emerge. A triangular trade industry that had a lasting and sustainable quality about it. But that's an industry we'll look at next time. And until then, I hope our time together this time has really made the history to come alive.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.